Thanks very much, Mike, for inviting me to give this colloquium. It's a great honor to speak to so many people who have much more knowledge in the whole UAP arena than I have. So I think before we start looking at the book and what the book's about, I'll just give a little bit more background on where I come from and what got me into this entire SETI and UAP business. I'm a lawyer, I'm not a philosopher, not a political theorist, so I plead for clemency from my two discussants, not to drag me into these fields too deeply because I will embarrass myself. I'm interested in moving to practical applications of law and not in mere legal theory. So I'm really keen to see legal aspects being brought forward to real-life political decision makers, as we'll see later on. My interest is therefore in the human legal interface with alien contact. I'm a relatively recent arrival in the community. I started this in 2019 to 2020, and my research was initially based on the traditional SETI scenarios, i.e. contact from outer space, and not on UAP. However, in my book, the first substantive matter I address in chapter 1, basically on page 1, is the UAP-shaped elephant in the room of SETI research. UAP easily fit into the categories of search for technosignatures and the search for artifacts, etc., but the traditional SETI community still refuses to engage with it. The SETI focus on outer space is, in my view, arbitrary and probably still has much to do with the financing streams and reputation risk issues if academics engage in lunatic fringe stuff like UAPs. I'll be 62 in June, so career issues do not really matter to me that much anymore. My position on UAP personally is what I like to call a statistical believer. Even if you discount all the errors and hoaxes that are out there, there's still too much evidence that A, there are unexplained phenomena, and that B, they are not human, even though they may not all be ETI either. They may be coming from somewhere else if you look at the work that, for example, Jacques Vallée has done on this. I am also not a so-called experiencer, and to be frankly, the idea scares me to death. So let's move to the main points of the book, which, as I said, is predominantly focused on a SETI approach. And they're about emphasizing that the statistics point to the likelihood that we are not alone in the universe. And if one includes UAP, possibly not even alone on this Earth. Secondly, that we will not know anything or enough about ETI until we meet them beyond a signal from afar. This contact may be hostile or benign, and we always need to remember that benign doesn't necessarily mean benign to us. It might be benign to other intelligent species on this planet, which might be octopuses and dolphins, for example. We need to be prepared for either scenario. It could be hostile or benign, as I said, and we cannot take alien altruism for granted. And we have to develop a planetary species consciousness from which we are so far, no pun intended, light years away. So I'll give you a brief rundown of the book. So chapters 2 and 3, after the introduction, are about introducing the reader to the natural science and social science aspects of SETI, and including questions of post-detection protocol regulation and a speculative idea of a cosmic meta law, of which I'm not a fan. Chapter 4 is an excursion into science fiction writing as an example of human imagination about possible contact scenarios. Chapter 5 then addresses the question, and this is where it gets properly legal, the question of application of the rules of war, or as they're called these days, humanitarian law, looking at the 4 major core offense categories of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and aggression. And after looking at the legal framework of how a hostile encounter might play out, I'm looking in chapter 6 at the factual question of where humanity's current defensive capabilities stand if we were to be attacked from outer space, for example. And that picture doesn't look too rosy in my view at the moment. And finally, in chapter 7, I deal with the question of a peaceful contact and with the terms and conditions which may be attached to an otherwise peaceful contact, especially through the lens of whether and to what extent we would be prepared to sacrifice human rights protections, for example, in exchange for technology that would save the Earth from all its many crises. And the example one of the examples I make there is what if the alien civilization or the so-called Galactic Club required us to deliver 1,000 humans as for experiments, which might have included cruel practices like vivisection and the like. What is that a price you'd be willing to pay to save the Earth? And in chapter 8, then I recap the main arguments, the main strands of the argument. So that's a very brief rundown. You have seen, if you got or you did get Mike's invitation, if you've looked at the PDF, you already know more what the table of contents looks like. So if you have any questions on the individual things there, of course, we can talk about these. So I have to give a final health warning. I'm fully aware that many of the things, the considerations in the book, may actually go out of the window depending on the future of the disclosures about UAP, especially if some of them are found to be of extraterrestrial origin. The other alternatives currently bandied about, interdimensional hypothesis or even more paranormal scenarios, are even more worrying from an epistemological point of view. It's therefore high time that UAP research is put on a rigorous foundation that includes all academic disciplines, and that SETI in particular sheds its allergic reluctance to engage with the field. There are too many bright people in SETI whose intellects could help advance the field significantly. It's also high time that we start considering the consequences of contact for human life on Earth and in far future scenarios, possibly in the cosmos. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Michael. So I'll turn it over to our discussants, and we can dive right in. Steve, and then Michael. I guess we can.
Can I ask a procedural question? Would you prefer me to just speak continuously for a few minutes, or should I be interacting directly with Michael? Because there are some things that could be picked up in sequence in what he said.
No, that's fine, Steve. You can kind of give your thoughts, and then Michael also, you can do the same. So we can do that in sequence. Yeah.
So you would prefer just for me to just sort of speak?
You can, surely. Yeah, sure.
Okay.
You go ahead first, Steve, because I mostly have questions and thoughts. I don't have like a prepared statement. So why don't you?
Right. All right. I mean, because let's work within the general framework of the introduction that Michael has given for people who haven't read the book. I mean, one of the things that's very striking from the book, and it comes out in the talk, is this idea that human beings need to develop planetary consciousness if they're going to be able to deal effectively with extraterrestrial intelligences. And this discussion unfolds in the context partly of the so-called Galactic Club, which Michael alluded to. And this is the idea that these extraterrestrials, who you might imagine are kind of a federation, so they already know each other and they discover us. And we are potentially eligible to become members of this Galactic Club, but there are going to be some dues, you might say, that we have to pay in order to be part of this, to show, in fact, that we're up to the standard of the Galactic Club. And this might involve things like vivisection of human beings, sort of the sort of thing that we traditionally think about in terms of animals and so forth. Now, what I'm wondering in this context is what exactly, how would, let's say, planetary consciousness puts us in a good position to deal with this question if it got presented to us. Would it be because we would then be able to, as it were, summon up what we all have in common as human beings that would enable us to stand up against this challenge? Or would it be that we would suddenly become panpsychists, right? So in other words, we suddenly realize that, in fact, consciousness is, as it were, something that's equally distributed among life forms. And so the problem is really the privileging of the human being that in a way leads us to resist these kinds of otherwise quite reasonable requests that the extraterrestrials say. If you sacrifice X number of humans in these experiments and so forth, right, there will be some greater kind of galactic benefit that will come from this. And so I'm sort of imagining what, because sometimes in the book it seems that planetary consciousness is basically a rallying call for humans to hang together and not be so divisive amongst themselves. But other times it seems that maybe planetary consciousness is actually trying to push in a different direction, which would be in a way to, you know, having us respect the multiple potential embodiments of consciousness across the universe, and thereby deprivileging the human in the process, and thereby making it easier for us to negotiate with these extraterrestrials. So I guess I would start, you know, that's a question to put on the table for Michael. I mean, there's some other things I can say, but this might be something that perhaps can get a certain kind of discussion going. So why don't I just put that for the time being?
So, Michael, do you want to go second, or do I respond to this right away?
I think it would be most natural if you just want to respond right away. And
Okay.
Chime in with questions, and if other people who are present have questions too, I think a good open conversation is ideal.
Yeah, will do. Okay, so yes, indeed, the initial meaning of talking about planetary consciousness is what you identified first, Steve. Is that we, what you call a kind of rallying together and finding a common, what I call a common human baseline for departure in dealing with contact with non-human or non-terrestrial life forms. So that's actually what the book means. The other thing, and that then relates to what I say in chapter 7 about these human rights protection and the like, is if you say deprivileging humans, then it means we need to take leave of our traditional overcome human rights thinking. So at one stage in the book, I think I called it actually humans' rights rather than human rights, because if you become a member of a network, then it's no longer understood that the network has the same ethical or even legal persuasions as you do, as the new guy on the block. So yes, that would be the question indeed, if we were to say, well, it's much more useful to be a member of such a network than sticking to our own human rights ideas and look where they got us so far, which, you know, they're all there in the book. And if we have kind of densely regulated human rights networks like European Convention, for example, or the Inter-American Convention, things like that, then yeah, there is some effect to that. But, you know, in the context of us dealing with a non-human life form, it doesn't actually mean very much. So, and yeah, I mean, if you take a very pragmatic or even cynical approach to human politics that we've seen so far, I could see a decision happening, maybe not on in proper public record, open parliamentary discussions, but on a more secret or covert executive level. That, you know, if the conversation with these aliens would be possible in the first place, that governments might get together, possibly, I don't know, the UN Security Council at the moment doesn't look very much like it, but maybe some powerful governments, US, Russia, China, and come up with their own deals if you don't have a planetary response to it, or even if it's a planetary response, there might be these governments taking the lead, and they say, well, so what? You know, we want this technology, we want to save the Earth, so what's a few humans compared to that? Politics is pragmatism, and you always have to rein the politicians in with the law, and it doesn't always work. So yeah, the answer is a purely pragmatic one. I could see that happen.
Does someone want to follow up on this?
Yeah, I can add something here. It's kind of a question, kind of a concern, I guess. I mean, so you two are talking about planetary consciousness. I'm curious to hear your thoughts, Michael, but also Steve, really. Kind of before we start talking about something as complicated and difficult or hard, you could say, as consciousness, I mean, what about just the status of the planetary as such for human beings who live on the planet currently? And so what I mean is, like, collectively, we seem to have a pretty terrible grasp of this, right? I mean, our sense of existing on a planetary and a specifically planetary space, or being members of a planetary community is first of all, it's relatively new historically, right? The conceptual architecture here is relatively new and largely undeveloped, and then facing planetary scale problems that are like unambiguously present and very costly, like climate change, like the ecological crisis, we have relatively little, in fact, functional infrastructure or political will to actually address these challenges in any meaningful way, legally, normatively, politically, just collectively, broadly speaking. So I'm kind of curious about, like, before we get to the planetary consciousness level of just like the material, legal, and political normative concerns, constraints, and developments vis-a-vis conceptualizing ourselves as a planetary species whose actions like are not really constrained by a lot of the, I don't know, architectural, infrastructural, conceptual elements that tend to structure things like international relations, but also people sent like their self-perception, their sense of like the causal effects and like ripple effects of the things that we do. And so like I'm curious what the value is. Maybe it's obvious and I'm missing it, but what the value is of approaching this from a consciousness kind of perspective as opposed to like a really kind of material or grounded one. Your thoughts?
Well, you know, I think we may be talking more about terminology than substance here, because I don't disagree with what you say. I'm not saying that, you know, it's something which the consciousness means just, you know, the realization that we are not anymore, or shouldn't see ourselves anymore as the citizens of whatever country we're talking about. It's that we are in the face of contact with non-human extraterrestrial civilizations. We are all of a sudden, all of us, citizens of planet Earth. And in order to have a effective and efficient response to all the challenges that contact with alien life forms might pose, it's in my view the best idea that we have a common understanding and also a common strategy and policy how to do that. I fully agree with you that we're miles away from that. So it's not that I'm saying my book is out and now everybody should just do what I say in my book. I mean, this is work that needs to be done now. It needs to start. So, for example, this SETI working group, which I founded with the IASL, is meant to take the first few baby steps in that direction. So we are working on basic principles that we will then put forward, you know, in the later stages of that working group to political decision makers and engage with the people who are meant to make that happen. And that has to happen on many different levels. You know, you can go to national governments, approach those. You can approach people like the UN and their specialist committees like UNUSA and all that. But it's a process which needs to start. That's what I'm saying. We don't have forever. If you look at the recent increase in interest, even official interest in UAP phenomena, you can imagine that it's not too long until we have some revelation that we are indeed not alone, and that we are indeed possibly not even the dominant species on the planet anymore, if we ever were. So it's time we start thinking about this, and as I said before, thinking about it in the context of the outer space scenario is one thing, and thinking about it in the context of the UAP scenario is probably quite another. So as I said, you know, just cut a long story short, I don't disagree with you. But the point is that we need to start thinking about it, what it means to be the people on a rather large piece of rock in the universe.
Can I respond to this as well, at least with a kind of probe? I would have thought from the standpoint of what Michael Yu is talking about, that maybe the Gaia hypothesis might be of some use as a kind of meta theory, right, to you know, as it were, to promote this kind of planetary consciousness that would make us more capable with dealing with the members of the Galactic Club when they come to us. I was wondering to what extent, more generally, in terms of the research in extraterrestrial intelligence, that the Gaia hypothesis, in a way, plays a kind of anchoring role for understanding what is at stake on Earth.
Well, the Gaia hypothesis, it has been in some ways hijacked by people who are more on the esoteric end of the spectrum. And I've just recently saw an article, or even a book, I think, which is engaging with a more scientific approach to whether the Gaia hypothesis could actually be made useful for exactly the kind of thing which you just mentioned, Steve. So my present fear is that this esoteric overtone that this has had so far might not be too helpful. But if we really can find evidence that the Earth is one huge giant organism, of which we are somehow inextricably parts, then of course it might help. But as I say, I'm not sure how far we are in actually getting traction on this Gaia idea.
Michael Uhal, you want to follow up there?
I mean, for what it's worth, there's a book called Facing Gaia by Bruno Latour, the late Bruno Latour, which is not really on the esoteric end of the spectrum at all. For whatever reason, I think Latour decided that this organizing metaphor or potentially foundational cultural or political myth served a particular and specific kind of political or cultural function, faced with the existential threat of climate change, right? And it's unclear to me at the present moment, and this will kind of tie back to the discussion we're having into your book, I think. It's unclear to me at the moment, even knowing Latour's work pretty well, or this kind of speculative hypothesis about really what is like a global or a universal human subject, I guess. And it's sort of like Latour is, very pragmatically minded, but it's sort of viewed in a somewhat more distantiated way, speaking out of both sides of your mouth. And I mean this in a positive way in the sense, because on the one hand, it's advanced as a potentially attractive or functional instrumental myth that could in some way serve to decathect or detach people from their attachment to local political conditions, local political identities, things like this, when faced with a severe and extant existential threat. And on the other hand, there's this more speculative element to mention of what politics would look like if things are shifted in this way. But I confess I'm a little bit not just skeptical, but the core idea here, and I just want to have clarity on what we're talking about here. Is the core idea here fundamentally something faced with a potential existential risk in a very serious way that is prospective, is the idea or hope then that humans, politically or culturally or personally or legally, will unify at a planetary or a species level scale?
Well, that is at the end of the day what I would like to see coming out of this. You have Ronald Reagan in 1987 talking to the United Nations General Assembly saying, if we were faced with an existential threat from somewhere outside Earth, then wouldn't we all just unify and pull together? And he then goes on to say, well, we already have something which is actually non-human, which is war. And it's anything which war could not be in the interest of the human species. So the idea isn't actually new. And Ronald Reagan, of course, was wrong. As if we, well, I should say, he would be proven wrong if the UAP disclosure at some stage found out that there were actually extraterrestrials and the governments knew about it all the time. So yeah, I find myself in difficulty disagreeing with you, and it's maybe just a question of the perspective you take on that. As I said before at the beginning, I'm a practical lawyer, so I want to do whatever is possible from my little neck of the woods to get this out of the mere theoretical discussion and start looking for ways to make the political decision makers listen up and do something. And from my previous experience as a judge and working in practice, it's very often the case that once you have something that looks like it's practically usable and you present it, that people then may actually take up on it. And they may or may not. There's no guarantee that it will work. But that is my personal approach to it. It may be naive, it may be completely futile, but for the moment, I still think there's some mileage to be had in it.
But it's not obvious that all of humanity unifying together is compatible with the Gaia hypothesis. I mean, because after all, one of the things that the Gaia hypothesis says, right, is that human beings are the primary source of all the various kinds of reduction of biodiversity and all other sorts of reduction of life on Earth. And so if in one sense one is talking about planetary consciousness and one takes the kind of Gaia approach, one of the things that one would have to do is, in a way, very severely discipline humanity before presenting this kind of unified planetary approach. So the idea of unifying humanity is one project. The idea of unifying the planet is another project, and they only overlap to a certain extent. And here I think this is where Bruno Latour is finessing, right? Because they're not necessarily the same project by any means.
Yeah, I think I should just be clear then that I don't think the Gaia hypothesis is, from my point of view, anywhere near a usable framework for what I'm proposing to do. So I'm called a pedestrian. I'm of the view that we need to work with what we have, and the people who are so far at least think they're in charge of the planet, that's the humans, and they need to work on this. If that will tie in, as I say, if there ever is scientific evidence for a whole planet organism, that's still to be seen. It may be, and how it ties in with that then will then be seen. But for the moment, I work with the tools that I have, and that is humans. And we need to move ahead. I mean, it's if we don't move ahead, then things will just happen to us. And at least we should try and take some precautionary measures to make sure that we are retaining some form of agency in the face of this existential risk.
So, Michael, if I can jump in before I hand it to Christian, just to kind of clarify some of the different threads of the discussion. I mean, there's a theoretical problem here, right? Which is, what form, from a political theory standpoint, what is the political theory of this kind of unified planetary approach to the response to a potential contact scenario. So I mean, there's the theory. What's that supposed to look like? What form should it take? And we can play these games. Is it Gaia hypothesis going to be part of the theory, the political theory there, and then we can distinguish these other projects, the consciousness project, the planet project, and so on. So there's a theoretical question there, like what form is this planetary response ought to take, right? So that's normative, right? But then, there's this other question, and I'm a Hegelian, I guess, at heart, which is, well, look, I mean, there has to be a process, a roadmap, which is partly pragmatic and practical, but which is also informed by some kind of theory, by some kind of thought about what it ought, what's our guiding principle here, what are the ideals to which we want to move the process from going to from where we are to where we ought to end up, right? So there's that as well. There's the roadmap that takes us from our current conditions to the situation that we'd like to end up, such that we can deal effectively in some sense of that with a contact scenario. And then of course there's just the practical reality, which is, if it's a sudden kind of disclosure, of course we're not going to be prepared. So it'll be foisted upon us. And under those conditions of a kind of an emergency, right, necessity is the mother of invention, and something will happen, and then we can theorize, perhaps, with catastrophe theory. So what is that actually going to probably look like, right? So there are all these sorts of questions, I think, right here to work out, and so Christian, I'll turn it over to you. I just wanted to do some housekeeping for a minute.
Are there any responses before I go in a different direction, I guess?
Go ahead.
Sorry. Do I respond? Do I not respond? Because I think I had.
You can, Michael. Yeah, please.
Yeah. Just to come back to what you just said, Mike. The political theory, again. I'm perfectly happy to call myself a pedestrian in that sense. We have institutions on Earth that are meant to help humanity unite in different ways. Here we have the United Nations, which is a global project, not looking too good at the moment. We have things like the European Union and ASEAN states, what have you. You have these kind of organisms everywhere that are trying to find at least a regional coherent response to certain problems. So, what would be the guiding, I wouldn't even call them theoretical, but kind of basically substantial, essential principles or issues we'd have to look at? First of all, if you're talking about process roadmaps, the one thing, if we're faced with an existential threat from outside of the Earth, is species survival. And if you go through my book when I talk about these different international crimes, that in an interhuman context, lots of them do not actually tolerate a defense. If we're talking about an attack by an alien species, if we could even defend ourselves, all of these protections would go by the board with this one argument: species survival. So we're not going to. We might be thinking about it now, but we're not going to afford them the same kind of a courtesy, if you want to call it that we afford ourselves, if we do it at all, between humans in warfare. That I'm fairly sure, if we came to the conclusion that throwing the biggest hammer we have in the arsenal as a first choice weapon, we will do that. If the other option is species annihilation, and then what would be the guiding principles? I think, from a lawyer's point of view, as I just tried to say in my introduction, human rights, of course. We need to be sure that whatever we do is consistent with the idea of inalienable human rights that we accord each other, and of course tied to that the rule of law. So any response we would choose should not fall foul of these principles. And then, as you say, if it is foisted on us and we're in the emergency arena, then you're right. Necessity is the mother of invention. Then, and whatever we will do there will not be theorized. So, in a sense, it's. I'm not sure how much theorizing on the political level is actually doable, because but then already moving to some extent in the area of meta-law considerations, where we're talking about general principles of ethical or moral standing that we assume we either have in common with these aliens or should be protecting against an alien attack. And it becomes extremely difficult then, because at the end of the day, in all of these discussions we're having, we're only talking to ourselves. We do not have another discussant who could test our ideas. We're just in a human echo chamber. I'll leave it for that.
Yeah, I just wanted to just really quickly follow up. I mean, do you think the concept of human rights actually is a place where one could kind of interrogate a bit? I mean, human rights in what sense? I mean, if you're a sort of a Kantian, you might be worrying about it's not just about the human per se, it's about our rational beings. And so one could perhaps even begin to expand the concept of human rights, if that's going to be the regulative ideal guiding us, in such a way that one makes room ethically, morally, philosophically, conceptually for the aliens, such that the assertion of human rights is not so specific as to alienate, right, the human from the alien, but in fact to move us towards a point of common existential relationship in some sense, such that we're not immediately going to aggressively assert the specificity of the human, but in fact offer, in a sense, a branch of universality in the hopes of at least providing a theoretical space of unity in the face of that. I mean, and I'm thinking it doesn't have to be just the, this alien. I mean, we're already doing that in a sense with the concept of rights for other intelligent creatures on the earth. So in a sense, the first other is right here on Earth, right? I mean, you know, I think somebody mentioned octopi and so on, dolphins, etc. I'm even reading articles about translating the languages, you know, of some of these species in some interesting sense, which will also be, of course, a question. We can't just simply assume that we would even perceive the forms of communication and symbolic mediation, if that even exists for any, you know, prospective being. Anyway, I'm sorry, Steve, you can jump in. And
I realize Christian wants to turn the discussion in a different way, but in response to this strand, this business about you know, the sort of them versus us scenario where we'll have to throw our biggest hammer at the extraterrestrials and so forth. I think a lot depends on how we regard those extraterrestrials who are attacking us, because and here I think a good way to think about this problem is in terms of what people's attitudes toward the prospect of superintelligence in artificial intelligence, right? That there may come to be a point where, in fact, computers can outsmart us in all the ways that we regard as being important. Let's say we grant that. And there's an open question as to whether that would be threatening. You know, so it is entirely possible, especially as artificial intelligence becomes much more part of our understanding of how the world works and we interact with it more. And to be honest with you, I think the more that we're thinking about extraterrestrial intelligences and UAPs and things like this, in a way, a similar kind of a customization is coming up, right? We're getting used to it. We're getting used to the possibility, right, that this is going to happen. We're going to confront them, right? And I think part of that process over a long term is actually going to make a much blurrier kind of conflict. In other words, one shouldn't assume that the humans are all going to be on one side, right, and these ETs are all going to be on the other. But rather there may be some defections from the ranks, you might say, right? And some blurring of the boundaries as already exists with regard to artificial intelligences, right? Where people are very much looking forward to a cyborg future and all of this kind of thing. And even some people even welcome the idea that there would be AI overlords, right? That could govern us more effectively than we can govern ourselves, right? And so it seems to me, this is where I'm a little bit skeptical, you know, because Michael B, right, really focuses a lot on this idea of there being a kind of ultimate war that would take place if there is some kind of a conflict situation. And I'm not so convinced, especially if it doesn't happen tomorrow, but happens, let's say, down the road, where people are getting more used to thinking about what the implications of these things are. So in a sense, the kind of conversation that we're having here, you know, as part of a beginning of a larger kind of dialogue, right, in fact, I think might minimize the extent to which there needs to be this kind of all-out war of, you know, of one side versus another.
Right. So let me just answer to that. The first thing which came to my mind when you talked about superintelligence and people's reaction to it is fear. So I mean, we've all watched, you know, the Terminator movies. So that's in popular sphere, probably one of the first things people would look to, first ports of call for what that might look like. And it, in essence, anything you just said, Steve, depends on what actually happens. Yeah, these are all contingent on the actual events that will unfold. And when you're talking about, we're getting used to it because there's so much talk in the news now about UAP, and we're getting used to the idea of, you know, some magnetar somewhere sending out regular signals that look like they're intelligent or whatever. We haven't seen anything yet, especially in the context of UAP. You know, we had over the week in this. Sorry, I just have to switch off my phone. Sorry about that. Especially people who delve very deeply in UAP research, and then we had discussions at this at a social event around Discovery Symposium that's currently happening in Durham. People who have actual experience of such encounters, they're not always too happy about what is happening to them. So we're moving into very controversial fields now, but since we are the UAP society, I think it's legitimate that we talk about this. And so we will know what it's like when we're actually face to face with it. I'm not so sure. Yeah, that will depend on how the disclosure is handled, and if it is actually capable of being handled by us rather than whoever is going to be disclosed. It may be, as you say, maybe at some stage we'll say, okay, it's not so bad, and if they are just, as Jacques Vallée has said, that they're coexisting with us on the Earth, but they're not us, then it may turn out that it's not so bad. But the thing that my book is about is, as you rightly say, is a particular hypothesis, which is, and as I say, from the SETI perspective, not UAP. What if? Because the discussion you have in the SETI community always proceeds from this assumption that just because they've come what they call through the great filter, they will all be benign and happy clappy, and they will be nice to us. I don't think that can be taken for granted. So, and in the context of the alien overlords, of course, there will always be, like in any occupation scenario, there will always be people who cooperate with the occupiers. We've seen that over thousands of years happening on Earth, and I don't doubt for a minute that there will be humans that will do that if we're actually under occupation from an alien species. Whether the alien species will actually need that is a different animal. But we can see that this issue about these overlords and the three-body problem. We've had the series now on Netflix. The book's been out for ages. And that is one example of what alien overlordship could look like at the end of the day. It ends in the destruction of the universe. Sorry for the spoiler for people who haven't read the book yet. But so I'm fully agree with you that it depends on what happens, and nothing can be predicted in an area which is so uncertain as even mere traditional scientific SETI, and even less so in the area of UAP.
Christian, before we get to Michael Uhal, I know you had your hand up about an hour ago, so
no problem.
Please.
The discussion has taken my turn, actually, Michael, because I remember having had the discussion with a German lawyer who also recently published a book on law and UAP, Klaus Stehle, I think you know him. And I asked him, what the universality assumptions of law actually do mean in that context, because I think that a lot of the terms that we've used in this discussion also, as war and cooperation and contact, I'd like to sketch a different scenario where there is clearly an intervention, meaning that something that happens on Earth affects us, but by no means it would be contact, because an overlord that has a different mind, maybe not even a mind, but obviously an intelligibly organized way of extracting resources or whatever, or taking us as samples, is affecting humanity, but there is no sign of interest. There is an absolute ignorance and disinterest. So there is no real interaction, but then we would be affected. This, of course, has the dimension of the baseline of the epistemology of the alien. I mean, we simply do not know what a different mind than ours would look like, and I find it fascinating that obviously we've been researching dolphins and clearly intelligent beings that obviously communicate and from my knowing is we hardly have any idea what they're actually talking about, and if they talk about anything. And so what I would like to ask you, Michael, is what are your ideas? You said that in the introduction that you're not talking about human law, but humans law, and I find that very interesting, and I'd like to challenge the idea that even law as a normative concept, a set of rules, could be something that is clearly not understandable by a being that would be some sort of a mind hive or whatever. And what are those frictions, and are we doomed to talk to ourselves and have no real chance to look at the case where we might be ultimately ignored, and not because we're not clever enough, but just because the other part has no epistemological framework that implicates communication in a sense that we know. Short footnote on that, Michael. I know we both like the free body problem, and I know that your surprise about the book and where it's taken you in your imaginations was a little different than mine, because what I found most interesting is that in the first, I think it's in the first or in the second book, and that's a spoiler, but not a bad one. There is a talking back and forth between the two civilizations, and the people from Trisolaris are absolutely surprised about the fact that humans can lie, because they obviously communicate telepathically, and there is no place for lie. So my question would be, is there even a place for law in a society that exchanges information with no chance to deceive? So there is no wrong or right in a sense, because everybody knows where they're at. That makes a big difference, and that's kind of the question, or where I ask your comments or ideas about that.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. We cannot, and that's what I'm saying all through the book. We cannot assume that we will encounter anything that looks like us, not just physically, but also psychologically and mentally, that they have the same kind of persuasions, moral, ethical, what have you. And they may not even have, as you rightly say, an understanding of law. Is exactly, though I'm making that point in a different publication I've written in 2014. But it's exactly, as soon as you're moving to something like a hive mind hypothesis, where everybody knows what everybody else is thinking, things like, for example, the presumption of innocence in criminal trials make no sense anymore, because everybody knows what's what. If you have a species that is a hive mind, that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't actually have laws, because these laws might apply to others who are not in the hive mind. So if the hive mind is the controlling organism on a planet, and it has other species on it, they might still produce laws to regulate the behavior of those other species. And I'm not sure whether a hive mind might regulate itself in anything resembling law. I mean, it's just, this is speculation upon speculation, so we're not really getting anywhere there. But the thing about contact, which you said at the beginning, that there might be this in total indifference. That is something which Tobias Gerritsen, in his new book, The Kosmische Krise, has actually pointed out, that so far, from his point of view, the behavior of UAP, as far as it's kind of more or less publicly traceable, is exactly that, one of supreme indifference to human potential desire for contact, or even at some stage, well, maybe if it's not outright hostile, but it's negative. And there is certainly, again, as far as we know, because there's such a large gray area in this field, there's no kind of verified contact where a conversation took place. We all thinking about Area 51 and Hangar 4 or whatever, and these things, whether they're true or not true, I don't want to go there. But if there is some sort of secret conspiracy about contact already having taken place, and in Ross Coulthard, in his book In Plain Sight, he seems to allude to something like that fairly towards the end. And again, all speculation. I'm not saying I'm taking that as read in a scientific sense, but it really very much looks like that they're not terribly interested. And contact as such, what is contact? When you're saying that they're here, they're not actually interacting with us, I think even the fact that they are, again, if it's them, that they're flying through our atmosphere and swimming through our oceans, that is an interaction. Yeah, because they're messing with our sphere of life. And they're giving us to understand, at the very least, that they can run rings around us. Again, this is all very speculative. And contact, final word, it doesn't, you're absolutely right, it doesn't have to mean that they actually come here and knock on our door and say, hi, here we are, take me to your lawyer, or whatever you want to say. But the contact might happen, for example, with a signal from outer space. If they're so terribly advanced, it might just be that they're sending us a sentient AI program which cracks all our computers and shuts down Earth. So that would be contact without anybody ever having been here. So again, we're coming back to the same issue over and over again. There is so much speculative potential in all of that. But that's exactly why I'm saying we should at least try and make an effort to get a few baseline points where we're not actually completely overwhelmed when anything happens.
I think we can turn it over to Michael. I think you had a comment earlier, unless you want to just hand it off, or Michael Uhal.
Yeah, just very briefly, because I want other people to be able to talk. I mean, very briefly, I think, I don't think there's anything pedestrian, much less idealistic about what you're proposing, Michael. I guess the question I've been pushing on, I mean, kind of part of it is like very agonistic sensibility of what the human politics are like, or maybe of just what politics are like in general. But I guess the underlying question is, it's not really even a challenge. It's not like a challenge or an assertion that anything you are saying is pedestrian or idealistic or anything like this at all. I don't think that that's the case, but there is an underlying question which is sort of bigger than any stances we're taking in this conversation about to what extent and in what ways political universalism is the apt or best or most functional or most likely, which is a huge spectrum of options here, right? But there's a question, I guess the question I'm posing is, to what extent a political universalism is actually any of those things as a response to a potential context scenario? I mean, we mentioned like, well, I forget the exact turn of phrase, but like the biggest hammer or the best possible response to an existential threat like this. And as problematic as what I'm about to say is, I'm not really making a proposal. It's a genuine, just an intellectual question at a pretty abstract level. It's like, well, is that the biggest hammer that we actually have for responding to severe existential threats, given like political universalism exists in a tension with already existing political divides, contentions, and agonisms between nation states, between political identities, between things like this. And so, of course, we wouldn't appeal to those things and say, oh, they've got everything squared away. They respond to risks and problems, particularly existential or planetary or like non-territorial bounded problems, particularly well. But there is this pre-existing conceptual and cultural infrastructure and architecture that's already present that doesn't actually easily fall into like a category of a politically universalistic response to not even necessarily existential threats, but just like regional conflicts and things like this. And so I'm curious, the point is not, oh, like which side do you pick, political universalism or some kind of political agonism or something like this. The question is something like, is really down to brass tacks, is the proposal here that faced with an existential risk of this magnitude and scale, the only or the most feasible option is a political universalism or not? And if not, or if there are problems with that, then what other options are available, given that we don't have that now, facing like a much smaller existential risks of various kinds, regional conflicts, etc. Like we managed to muddle through sometimes and often not very well. But I'm just curious about like the assumptions here about what a possibly functional or a good enough response would be, and if political universalism is really the only thing that like is the only ticket that actually like functions here in response to this thing.
Right, thanks very much, Michael. I think first of all, I may need to comment on the use of the term "the biggest hammer." I think we may be misunderstanding each other here. When I talked about are we using the biggest hammer in the response to an alien attack, I wasn't talking about a political concept, but pretty very specifically in the context of the proportionality principle in international humanitarian law. So you're not meant to use the biggest weapon you have straight away as a weapon of first choice if there's another way of reaching the same result with less collateral damage. So that's what I was referring to. No, but your other question, it's it's very pertinent, and who am I say to patronize you? But it's, of course, political universalism at the moment. It looks like a lost cause to begin with, and then you rightly say we're not even getting stuff organized on a regional level properly. That said, it's not something that you shouldn't keep striving forward. They always say the perfect is the enemy of the good, and that's pretty much my philosophy in many walks of life. That if you're always waiting for the perfect thing to come around without taking the first step towards it, it's never going to happen. The other option, and I think I also addressed it in my book at some stage when I respond to this editorial by Builder in the American Journal of International Law, where he quite rightly says, if there was such a, say, an international treaty to deal with this, preparing Earth for alien attack, let's be very speculative about that. Who would be the people actually who had the power to do anything? And that would mean, at the end of the day, I don't know how many seriously spacefaring nations we have on this planet at the moment. So it would be the Americans, it would be the Russians, the Chinese. I don't know. There are a few other ones queuing up, but they're not on the same level. So if we leave it as it is and just make do with that, it will mean a few nations running the show. And at the end of the day, if you have these nations, they might even be competing with each other to get contact with the extraterrestrials. We're not just talking about peaceful exchanges about philosophy and whatever, and we're talking about alien tech, as it's called. Yeah, if there is the possibility of getting an advantage from alien technology, I bet very much that there would not be much cooperation on the side of these major spacefaring nations, and certainly not even if they were organizing in concert, they would not necessarily want to part with that technology with everybody else on the Earth, especially if it has military uses. So as they say, I wasn't born yesterday, so I know what we are like, and I know what geopolitical military politics look like. But again, if we just give up and let it be as it is, then we're not going to get anywhere. I don't expect anything like that to happen in my lifetime. It's not something that happens in the next 20 years. Humans are just too slow for that, and always kind of barring whatever disclosure might come around and whatever it does to the human psyche across the globe. And there might be even different reactions in different countries to that kind of disclosure. But at the end of the day, I think I just need to come back to the perfect is the enemy of the good. Let's keep trying. But that's there isn't anything cogent, compulsory, or mandatory about it. It is either we do it or possibly are doomed.
Steve, you want to follow up?
Yeah, I guess my attitude toward a lot of this aspect of the discussion is to try to de-exoticize it a little bit, right? So in other words, and this might be just a general attitude I have toward this topic, namely that there may be more precedents to what we're talking about here than we imagine. So in the first case, the business about the aliens not being interested in us, but nevertheless having some kind of encounter with us, I wonder, to what extent we're already kind of familiar with this with regard to how animals and plants, other than the ones that we domesticate, regard us. In other words, do we not think of these beings that have been on Earth for a long time coexisting with us as largely not interested in us? I mean, that would be one sort of question. So in other words, there is a precedent for this where in fact this does allow for a certain kind of coexistence. And the second one has to do with this point. I think it had to do with when Michael B. was talking about the free body problem, about one of these civilizations not being able to lie. right? And I found that kind of, and I've heard this kind of, line before about, that there are these civilizations out there that are incapable of lying. And I sort of wonder, in that case, how are they capable of second order thought? Right, because lying is basically a byproduct of the ability to think about thinking. And if these are advanced intelligences of some sort, they probably do have the capacity for second order thinking. And that then gives them the capacity to lie. Now, it may be, since we're talking about the law, that they have some kind of psychologically imposed legal mechanism that, in a sense, restricts their second order thinking so that what we call lying doesn't happen to them. But nevertheless, it would seem to me that they would have the capacity to lie insofar as they are they can think at the second order level. And I'm just wondering what Michael B. thinks about that. I mean, again, maybe I'm being a little too literalist or something about this, but maybe these situations aren't quite as strange as we're making them out to be.
Thanks, Steve. First of all, animals and plants. The dogs we had during our lifetime, my wife and I will probably take offense with you saying they don't care about us. So
no, but you breed them. They're bred.
Yeah,
they're bred.
I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
So of course there is there is some interaction, even if it's just popping up at the veranda door every morning to get the food. We just had a stray cat the last 2 months who did just that. Basically, she domesticated us rather than the other way around. But you're right about how do we know whether or how animals and/or plants actually regard us, and the reason why this is interesting, other than you saying it, of course, is that Stefano Mancuso, an Italian plant biologist, and we talked about that before, has published a book recently in which he has this wonderful line that for plants particularly, what is white for animals is black for plants. So the way that plants function is entirely different from the way animals function. But the one thing which he said wonderfully is it is so different for them that they might as well be aliens. So that there is one thing which I think we can profitably try and look into is plant intelligence as such. I don't think is anywhere disputed anymore. When you look at the literature, and just started doing a project on that, when you look at the literature, it is unanimous that there is something which you can call intelligence. There is a coordinated reaction to stimuli in a sense that we would ordinarily define intelligence. So that's not the issue really, because it's much more interesting if we're moving to plant behavior, and that has an overtone. Do they have ethics, morals? Are they altruistic, or they are just looking out after number one? Which is, this is the idea I'm after now. To which extent could we expect altruistic behavior from plants if they were ever to rise to a level that they would communicate with us? All very speculative. Or just, again, we're coming back to this issue that if we're talking about animals, the only people we can talk to is us. We don't have the capacity yet to talk to dolphins on a philosophical level. The same thing with octopi and other higher primates.
You can't even talk to humans at a philosophical level. What are you talking about?
Yeah, possibly. Yeah.
I think that's
so I mean, that's. You're right that there is already this kind of situation on Earth, but to which level the sentience or sapience of these creatures has risen already, we do not know yet. But if somebody comes to us in a major spaceship from outer space, and tries to open communications channels on a radio frequency, they are sentient, they are sapient. That's so far on this one. The other one was not being able to lie. Now, first of all, as much as I like the three-body problem, we shouldn't forget that it's science fiction. It's a fictional account. The idea is certainly attractive, and it makes absolute sense if you're talking about a hive mind where everybody knows what everybody is thinking. That, as you say, doesn't necessarily exclude that that hive mind can actually use ruses or other deceptions against anybody who is outside the hive mind, using the hive mind's potential against others. And that might, even if you don't call it outright lying, it might just, as Michael Ashkenazi has said in his book, it might just mean not telling us everything that they would otherwise truthfully tell us if it doesn't suit their purposes. So it's a very fine line dividing that, whether that's lying or not just letting on everything. So you know that the normal oath people have to swear in court, not just lying, but not leaving anything out that they should be telling. But if there is such a thing as a hive mind where everybody knows what everybody's thinking, I do not necessarily rule out that they then might, as such, have a completely different attitude, and also the actual wherewithal to treat non-members of the hive mind differently. So, and again, it's science fiction, so shouldn't be taking it too far in this direction. Thanks.
Michael, I wanted to shift to some of the material in your book, in the center of your book, in particular chapter 5, where you're talking about hostile contact and international domestic law sort of context. And in particular, I just wanted to get you to talk a little bit about, and maybe we could have some discussion about section 3 of that chapter, in which you talk about liability of ETI, and in part you mentioned the nullum crimen principle. So if you could talk a little bit about that, because now we've talked a bit theoretically about approaching ETI. What should be the form of our response? Is it universalism? Is it not? Questions about consciousness, contact, and so on. But now, in a sense, more practically speaking, what if we're in this scenario in which we want to hold them accountable or liable for something? And so what are your thoughts there?
Just a second. Yeah, it all begins. Thank you. It all begins with the question whether we accord them person status, because and I think Steve started hitting on this idea of your human rights and potentially extending that to our visitors from space. First of all, they might be offended if we actually accorded them human rights, because they think we're so underdeveloped that it's offensive to them to be held to the same standards. But that point aside, if we do not accord them person status, as for example human rights treaties require, then there would be no question of a legal responsibility. We would just be doing with them whatever we do with animals anyway. We would now we're a little bit more advanced in that it's but we'll usually be treating animals as objects, as chattel, and the animal rights movement is not such a long-standing affair. It's fairly recent, and again, and we talked about that before, Steve. The animal rights are rights we accord to them. They don't step up and say we would like to have that. We have the discussion and we say we should be giving those animals these rights, and who enforces them? It's the humans. So they can't enforce them themselves unless they want to bite us on the leg, of course. So liability of ETI in a legal sense depends on person status. And there, again, as you said, you refer, or was it Mike referring to Kantian's concept of rational beings? That is also where you could, in the context of us being liable versus them, for example, use the concept of crimes against humanity, which is centered on humans, but what makes a human human? And it's probably one answer would be rationality, being a rational being. So and there we still get into the problem, not just the nullum crimen, but it's part of the nullum crimen. You cannot apply criminal law by analogy. That's one principle that I think human jurisdictions across the world have. You can apply a law by analogy if it's to the benefit of the offender, but never to the detriment. So that would already be a problem. So secondly, even if we were to give ETI person status, legal person status, they would not, I wouldn't even say necessarily, would not be bound by our laws. These laws are not for aliens, they're for us. So the United Nations, the Security Council, what have you, the Constitution of the United States, they mean nothing to them in a legal sense. And any kind of compliance with those would be a courtesy on their part. They might, for example, agree with this principle, we don't know, and say, yeah, it's fine, great, about, we love the First Amendment, or whatever, the German basic law, that's all great ideas, and we fully buy into that. Maybe not. And if they don't, then legally speaking, they are not bound by anything. So that's why all of these ideas that we could just simply apply human legal frameworks to aliens when they appear on our doorstep, I'm not really enamored by that idea. So civil liability moves around the same principles, more or less. So I think your liability of ETI, I think the chapter or the section I have in that chapter is very brief, because I don't see any real prospect of making that work if we're actually treating them as legal subjects and not just as things to do with as we please. That also applies in the context of prisoner of war idea. So would we give them a POW status or not if we were able to catch some of them in a conflict? So this is, from a legal point of view, that's a lost cause, I think. Unless they agree to be bound, we cannot bind them legally. And the question of using force and therefore making them comply is a completely different animal.
Michael, to what extent do you think that we're required, because we're dealing with we would be dealing with an intelligence here, and it's possible, although it may be hard to conceive exactly what form it would take, but it's certainly possible that that an intelligence with which we might come into contact, an alien intelligence, has their own concept of rights. So to what extent do you think that ethically we're responsible for determining the extent to which they have a concept of rights, and to what extent would we, in some sense, be bound to accept the form that takes? Or do you think that we would have to sort of engage in this evaluation? Do we think that their concept of rights is legitimate, et cetera, and so on?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Again, that it depends very much on the form of contact, and if we're actually able to communicate with them on such a high conceptual level. I'm not sure whether you could say that either of the species would be required to inquire about the other's legal views, if they have any. And in a sense, if there is contact with communication, that kind of thing will probably take care of itself. So if you can talk, you start asking the big questions first, and that is how do you organize your society, and how are we going to get along with each other? And then we're just looking at overlapping circles. If there are legal concepts that they think should be the bedrock of a society, and it just so happens that we have the same views, well, then there we are. And then, in a sense, if we're actually on an equal level, and then it's not a question of occupation or whatever, if they're willing to live peacefully, coexist peacefully with us, then we'll have to do the same thing as we're doing with minority populations in our own societies to this day. That's what human rights are for. There's always a majority who would like to do things the way that they think best, but that's what human rights protections came in for, so that the minorities can actually participate in the political enterprise at more or less the same level. So again, it all depends on what the power dynamics are, and if they're willing to engage on an equal level. And then I think if we're able to communicate, that might be the way forward. It would probably be in their interest as much as in ours. So, but whether we required, it's a matter of self-preservation, I think, that you find out what the other people are thinking.
Steve or Michael, do you want to follow up or ask some different questions? Steve, I think your mic is off. It has disappeared. Michael Uhal, do you want to
Sure.
jump in?
Yeah, I wonder about the. I mean, I'm a theorist, right? So I feel comfortable asking such a sort of theoretically mediated question. But like, what the conditions, what the conditions of sufficiency are for engaging in politics, in legal negotiations, even in communications in a way. I mean, this is kind of maybe riffing a little bit off of Steve's earlier point when he asked earlier, is like, if they're so if these prospective hypothetical agents are so different from us that like channels of communication can't be established, or like basic political interactions, and I mean that not in a theoretically like a highfalutin kind of way, but in a very basic sense of negotiating over an outcome, understanding that scarcity has material consequences for participants in a negotiation or a conflict or a communication, like understanding that there is, like, in some sense, I don't mean this overly formally or anything, but in some sense there are trade-offs in communication. When you're talking, someone else isn't talking. When they're talking, you have to not talk at the same time, just to get information transacted back and forth between the parties in question. Like, it's sort of like if there's a baseline of political interactivity, then a whole bunch of questions and options and possibilities and dangers become cognitively tractable or intellectually negotiable insofar as you can talk about these things, or you can take actions that have responses that are related to the actions taken, or something like this. It's almost like a basic social causal framework of agents agents who meet the bare minimum standard of agency, such that you can interact with them agentially. Like, and if that isn't met, it seems like we're talking about just a totally different kind of ballgame, because now we're talking about something that is so, I mean, I don't know, whatever you want to call it. It's so other, it's so exotic, it's so different from us, like that it's unclear, like, what even the basic vocabulary we would employ to talk about how you transact with such a thing. I mean, we run into this problem with like very quotidian earthly kinds of things like plants and animals now, right? Because you have like certain dearths of feedback that are structured in ways that we can easily integrate into existing social codes and like communications regimes and things like this. So I guess I'm a little curious to hear about like your sense of the spectrum of agential possibility of prospective ETI, ranging from those with whom you can do politics in any sense at all, whether it's conflictual or legally mediated, or you all get along and everything's great, to like non-interactability, but still present. Because it seems like a conceptual confusion that's often present in the space, or maybe not a confusion, but a question about what basic cognitive purchase one has, not just trying to model prospective hypothetical ETI, but how we would index our decisions, behaviors, all of those things that go into politics and law vis-a-vis that prospective agent. Like, where's the baseline and what establishes that baseline?
Thank you. Again, I'm going to come back with a very pedestrian answer. It depends. And that's the favorite phrase of lawyers. When you ask a question about legal issues, it depends. And it depends here. If we are able to communicate, then it will depend on the level of communication. We may just be able to ask each other the way to the next train station, or we may actually be able to engage on a very high level of abstraction. All the communication research that has been done, and as far as I saw it, and on the research I did in my book, would actually probably speak against that likelihood that there would be a likelihood of having a contact that includes fulsome communication. So if there is communication, I think, as I said before, the whole thing will probably take care of itself. And if there are any gaps left, then it will become a matter of power dynamics. And we have the same thing on Earth. It's not like we need to look at the aliens first. We have over all history had negotiations, especially negotiations about a truce or the end of a war, where one side did not have the same power or the capital of persuasion as the other side, and it was then up to the side with the bigger power potential to decide whether they wanted to be lenient or not. And I think, in a sense, again, we're speculating here. I would imagine the same thing happening. It would depend on whether we're on an equal footing as far as power projection is concerned, and by that I also mean military power projection, or whether we're not. And then if we're not, it will then depend on what ETI has in mind for us. If we're not able to communicate at all, and but we're not at such a remove that the Thucydides trap would become relevant, that we don't know what the other side is thinking. That's also brought out very nicely in the three-body problem, in this theory of, or the social theory of the universe, that she exposes that this is endless regression about guessing about what the other person or the other side is thinking. It's difficult to say, I don't want to make this kind of funny comparison to tourists going to a country where they don't speak the language and they're communicating via hand signals. But it's a situation, again, which will have to play out on its own. It's difficult to theorize about it unless you have general, communication research. I'm not the expert on that, on how you regulate or how you solve or diffuse such situations. It will depend on what efforts are made, and when one side determines that the efforts are not fruitful, and it's time to take another avenue to solving the problem of how we coexist. So I find it difficult to make generalizations about it, because it always depends on what's actually going to happen, and we should always remind ourselves, what we're talking about here is speculation. My book is one major speculation, apart from the introductions to SETI and the stuff which is already out there. But everything other, many people would call lunatic fringe, and that's why I'm very careful to get too far ahead of ourselves in these considerations about what would happen if, and what kind of abstract principles might arise from such a contact. As I said before, I'm not a friend of this idea of meta law, because at the moment it's just us talking to ourselves. But there would, at some stage, then once contact is made, there might be a path to that kind of thing. But and coming back to what Steve said before, it's like, would we just remain humans, pure and simple, or would we say, actually, we need to see the bigger picture and maybe drop some of our traditional persuasions and get with the program? All of that might happen, but we should not forget that at the moment we're just speculating.
Steve, before you jump in, I just want to make sure that the rest of the guests that are gathered here with us feel, I think at this point we could also entertain any other questions from anybody else. But Steve, go ahead, and then Christian.
Yeah. First of all, my apologies for being short-circuited for a couple of minutes. I'm wondering, Michael, what... So let's take UAPs off the table. There is a distinction that you mentioned in your book between SETI and METI, right? Where SETI is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence and METI is the messaging of extraterrestrial intelligence. It's a much more proactive kind of thing, right? Where we're actually looking for these guys, right? We might not know what to do once we find them, but we're looking for them in a very active way. We're not just, as it were, listening to see whether they're out there, but we're actually trying to find them. Do you have any views about the ethics of that? I mean, especially in light of the fact that, you know, we don't know what we would do if we encountered them. I mean, this kind of line of argument that you've been pursuing. Some, like David Brin, for example, the science fiction author, right, says that it's somehow unethical, right, to actually be actively looking for these guys in outer space, right? And I'm just wondering, how do you think about that, given all the uncertainties that would be involved in an actual contact?
I fully share Brin's view. I think it's absolute foolishness. I know just Michael just posted this METI or Regretti reference. There is a huge discussion, and Catherine Denning has written this fairly similar paper on unpacking the great transmission debate about the whole METI issue. METI is, in my view, it's not just unethical, it's dangerous. Why? Because it's an activity which is, its self-professed aim is to bring about a situation which humanity cannot control. So if they actually respond, and again, going back to science fiction scenarios, this movie Battleship, they might be here faster than we think, depending on their capacity of travel. And it's, there are the arguments where we've been sending out these signals for hundreds of years or 100 years now through, because we've had a general broadcasting, but that's not the same thing. When you're broadcasting, you're not actually advertising the position of Earth in the solar system or things like that. As I say, I think it's dangerous. It should be prohibited. So far, yeah, exactly, dark forests, Yushishin again, that there should be a regulation of it, and until and unless we can actually control what's happening, which is probably going to be never, we shouldn't be doing this. It's absolutely fine to listen, to the extent that listening itself doesn't actually already betray your position. There's possibilities for that as well. But sending messages out, or probes like the Pioneer probes with the golden records and everything on it, basically telling them, well, this is what we look like, and this is where we are. Come, go and get us. I think it's foolhardy. So I'm not even going to unethical. But if you are taking that background, putting Earth in a situation without any political mandate. It's just scientists going ahead, doing what they think. It's like little kids with a chemistry box. I wonder what would happen if I put those two solutions together, and then it goes bang. That's the mindset I see in many of these people. Just let's see what happens. And I think that's a gamble which we shouldn't be doing on a global scale. So if you see that as the background, it's not just dangerous, it's also unethical in my view. And I'm making no kind of qualifications on that. We should not be doing it, period.
Christian?
Yes, I totally agree on the points that were made here. Again, I want to take the discussion or a question that goes back to the point of origin of the discussion, because I can tell you that with the concept of disclosure that is being debated at the moment, and you heard from the people that were on the Seoul conference that there is something like catastrophic disclosure, anticipating certain secondary effects on economic, religious, ideological systems, etc., etc. Something that has been disturbing me about that idea of disclosure is that it seems to be quite set in a Western mind with respect to how people will culturally experience, the acknowledging of the fact that there was something like contact or something like an alien species that has been, acting on this planet maybe for a long time. I'm saying that because firstly, I think we always need to de-bias ourselves with that respect, because I really think that, for example, that a culture that has a colonial background would probably have a very different mindset to the idea of being colonized again, because they themselves would see a repetition of a historical pattern. I think that is very, very alien to many of the US American people, because they've, from what I know, they haven't been conquered on their own land yet. They've just been conquering. So they've been on the different side of the spectrum. And maybe that's why, you know, a lot of what comes out of Hollywood is driven by so much hysteria when it comes to the idea of the alien. But what I wanted to say also is, when we're talking about, you know, the moment of contact, there is a big question of who talks on our side. You know, what is actually our side, you know, and who is capable. And that kind of links to the METI problem that you were saying at the moment, because I don't want to be represented by, you know, some nut guy who has like the biggest projection tool and is driven by the idea that technology is going to solve every little issue that would be around about human existence. So in a sense, it's just a, you know, it's a comment to what you were saying, but also I think it's a really big question of who talks for us. You know, if there is this, and that, you know, relates back to the original question, a unifying moment and humanity as some sort of a imagination. It's a politically imaginary, and how do we deal with that, Michael? What do you think? And maybe you have a very pragmatic answer for that.
Oh, of course I have the answer for that, yeah. I'd be a rich man if I had the answer for that. No, but I fully agree with you on the issue of the cultural framework in which we're asking these questions. There is a lot of Eurocentric, and when I say Eurocentric, I include all the people in the Western Hemisphere, so our American friends as well, because they are in essence Euro, although they don't like the idea. So it's all the old white men or the young white men, and these days also the females talking about things which is in their own framework of experience and intellectual mindset. So I fully agree with that. And as you know, and I'm spilling the beans here on a project which is happening soon. Andreas Anton and I, together with John Elliott from UKSRN, are about to launch a global survey on precisely these questions. You know, how would people react if there was, you know, the different context scenarios? We just kind of divvy them up a little bit. So what if there was an artifact discovered on the moon, or there's a live spaceship entering the atmosphere? All these different, you know, it's getting closer to home more and more, and, you know, how would people react? And then so the cultural reaction to contact, but it's also what we're asking is, how would people want humanity to respond? You know, if there, who gets to talk to the aliens, and so that do we have a referendum, a global one? Your research in the UK, recent research has shown that people actually don't want to have a referendum on that. Do we let the scientists do the talking? Do we give the politicians? I mean, let's not kid ourselves. If it ever comes to that, the politicians and the military will take over, because they will militarize everything. But so who would people want to entrust with talking on our behalf to an alien species? As an international lawyer, you think, well, something like, yeah, Billy Meyer, I'm sure. Something like the United Nations, maybe. And if you look what you're addressing here, are actually post-detection protocols. And the IAA, the International Astronautical Academy, has already drafted, for decades now, the IAA protocols that are meant to deal with that. And there, it's, at the end of the day, it goes to the Secretary General of the United Nations. But yeah, that was before the advent of your ubiquitous social media, and before your people become so driven by being the first ones to find something new that gets them, you know, either a knighthood in this country, or it gets them humongous funding streams, because if they are the ones who basically control the discovery. So, or just because somebody wants to have their name on Facebook, and you know, whether a scientist who discovers that would actually be capable of containing themselves and not posting about it. So all of that has changed dramatically. That doesn't mean, again, coming back to the perfect being the enemy of the good, that we shouldn't strive to have some sort of regulation of who should be doing it, and then possibly, as I forgot the name. I think John Gertz is thinking about this idea of having a treaty just among humans, not with aliens, that actually criminalizes the act of disclosure that is not sanctioned by political decision makers. So these are very uncomfortable questions. You don't want to go out there and criminalize scientific work, but at some stage you have to think about what does it do to public order. And we all know that each and every jurisdiction on Earth has public order offenses that do not actually track any individual legal interests, but the interests of the whole. So I don't see that as outlandish. The question is just how do you enforce it? Yeah, that's what we're trying to find out in this survey, which will hopefully soon go live. There are so many problems with the software. It's unbelievable, but it's something we hope to find a few interesting data on. And on top of that, if I can just add that, we will also be editing a book for academic contributions. So people here might be interested. We've just been told that Routledge is going to offer us a contract. We just need to hammer out a few details, but that will be something where we will also put out a call in due course.
Steve, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm just, again, this is just a question about, I don't know the answer to it, but have people thought about perhaps having an artificial intelligence program be the voice box of the human race, right? In especially given what is, if we are imagining how these beings are likely to operate in terms of communication, already the way we seem to be communicating with them does seem to suggest something that might be tractable to artificial intelligence and might actually eliminate some of the noise that may come about if human beings, especially if we're talking about very specific human beings with specific emotional makeups and dispositions and so forth, because this seems to be the great worry that you are articulating about human beings, right? Politicians, what are they like? Scientists, what are they like? Right? But perhaps artificial intelligence might provide a kind of calming force in the matter. I mean, again, I guess the question I would have there is there someone thinking along those lines at the moment and thinking about developing artificial intelligence programs that might be able to function in this capacity?
Well, I haven't heard of that. It doesn't mean it's not happening, but it's not something I've looked into. I would imagine somebody like John Elliott, for example, who's done a lot of work on machine intelligence, machine learning, and linguistic issues in contact with species that don't talk human. He might have some ideas about that, but I'm not aware of it. The only thing I'm conscious about is that it depends on what this AI actually does. And are we talking about well, at the moment it's apparently not that far that AI has become self-aware, back in Terminator country, of course. But I can imagine AI being a useful tool, as you say, is at decluttering the noise and decluttering the conversation. That might actually presuppose on the other end of that conversation is something similar that can actually connect with what an AI does. So as long as we're using it as a tool to facilitate conversation, fine. If we are leaving it to the AI to actually structure the conversation, not just formally, but also as far as substance and essence are concerned, I'd be very reluctant to go down that route. And especially, these intelligences are self-learning. You never know what they might learn from the other side.
They'll become traitors.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you want to put it like that, they might become traitors to humanity. So it's all these things where again, this is not so far speculation because we already have pretty advanced AI and we can imagine what they might be capable of doing, but we can also imagine why they might, even if they're not self-aware, they might be abused for something else. The first thing that people are doing with AI is bringing up fake pictures of people in the public mind, or I don't know, we're not going to go down there too much, but fake porn and all that. It's always the kind of the worst elements of humanity that are being kind of furthered by that technology. So it's, yeah, as a tool, as long as you can control the tool, fine. If they're actually running the show, no.
Yeah,
could I sort of just intervene for a sec? I mean, you know, part of the discussion about or most of the discussion about contact, it seems, kind of does presuppose a, you know, a one voice for all kind of a framework. I mean, and I mean, maybe it's just going to be much more complicated than that and much more difficult, right? I mean, so Michael, you consider a number of different first contact scenarios, right, in chapter 4. So what happens in cases where, you know, and of course, far be it for me to want to drift into the more, you know, extraordinary and speculative, but I mean, what if contact looks or takes the form of something very intimate and personal, where it's one being and another being? It's not a galactic club. It's not a race. You know, it doesn't have this sort of universality, which seems to be the presupposition in many of the ways of our having discussed these contact scenarios. I mean, what if it's very intimate and it's one being to another being? One problem epistemologically is that that can't be considered evidential, and therefore it can't be part of the public understanding that that is factual, right? So, but what if that is in fact the form, right? The form that contact takes, and then is the contactee therefore responsible for humanity and so on and so forth? You know, so I understand we're drifting into, you know, really dangerous, but I mean, what if that? I mean, it could be the case, right? I mean, so Michael.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. Again, my favorite answer. If that that one-to-one contact, it's if it happens in a spirit of open curiosity and interest on both sides, and in a non-exploitative way, then, you know, I don't necessarily see a case for a major regulation framework to be brought up for intimate contacts with alien beings. The problem is, if you say that would the contactee be responsible for humanity, that depends on what the contactee finds out from the contactor. So if the contactor has ideas about humanity that are not necessarily to the benefit of humanity, then I could imagine that there would be a moral duty on the human to actually let people know who would be in a position to thwart these plans. But it is, you know, when you're talking about an intimate or relationship, it might actually imply, and it's, you know, we're getting really off the rails here, it might imply something like love. So then you get all these additional emotional constraints that you have, even if that we have with humans already. So even if you know somebody else, a human is going to do a terrible thing, but you're in love with them, and you don't, they might be your son or your daughter or whatever. You may feel unable of actually making sure that their plans are thwarted. So, and that's really not where my book is going. So I'm a bit uncomfortable of extrapolating from that on such scenarios. But yeah, there are so many.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm also asking, I guess I'm probing the sort of, you know, the conditions of possibility for contact itself. I mean, you know, it seems that there are, you know, these two extreme cases. One case is, the extreme is it's a one being to another being, but could that ever be considered even contact in some sense? I mean, it can't be. It could, you know, it can't be considered sort of contact for humanity. It can't be considered you know, an evidential case of contact. And then you have the other extreme, which is that you know, they come crashing in and everybody sees it and the governments get involved, and then there's kind of already this kind of universality is foisted upon us by the very form that the contact takes. So you have these two extremes, and in the one case, it seems like you can't have, that really can't even be considered in some legal or public sense contact. In the other, it obviously would be. So what would you say about that kind of a spectrum of forms there?
Yeah, I mean, if it's a sort of personal encounter, I would see this as contact, and then it would depend who these people are. If there's also this kind of gray overlap area. What if the leader of the alien species makes a one-to-one appointment with the president of the United States? That's a two-person scenario, but we're already in a situation where it may have repercussions for both societies. So again, it always depends on who these people are, what their intentions are, and how the power dynamics play out. But I would not say it's not contact. It may just be, for example, it may be the preferred way of an alien species or an alien network of making contact with a new kid on the block to approach an individual person and to find out, how that species ticks, emotionally, intellectually, whatever. And rather than coming in with all guns blazing or having your 12 spaceships in Earth orbit, it may be that's their preferred form of first contact, and then you won't hear from them again for the next 500 years. Who knows? I don't know. It's difficult to answer that question, actually.
Yeah, Brenda.
Hi. What if first contact is the UAP phenomenon? I mean, we're talking about it as something that will happen in the future. What if it's been happening for the last 75 years? And the way in which it has been happening is actually communicating something to us if we're smart enough to figure it out. But contact has already happened. What if?
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying in my book, and what I try to say at the beginning of my introduction is then all the cards are off the table, because that is at the moment, and we're into wild speculation country, because the whole disclosure business means that there might be something happening that some people know about and they don't tell the others, and we have people who are experiencers, and I've met a few. And they tell you, there are serious people. They're not con men or con women or what you call it, and you take their word at face value because they are serious and honest people. If these people tell you they've made contact in whatever form, better than I. There's loads and loads of different forms that people have. Narrated over the decades or even the centuries. This is no longer in an area where we can regulate. There it becomes a real question of the power dynamics. And so far as I've seen, not being an experiencer myself, but from what I've heard from others who would say they have been, it is not something which you control, or at least not to a measurable degree. And it's difficult to regulate because then we're already, and that's why I'm saying at the beginning that we need to be worried about whether we're actually the dominant species on the planet. And if you look at the technologies they run rings around us. They are, if you listen to some people who have these experiences, they are able of manipulating our minds. I find it very difficult to come to that field with any regulatory ideas, because the regulation is being taken care of for us. So, and that's what I'm also saying in my book, and what I said at the beginning, that all of this might go out of the window if UAP are actually not just non-human, but also not from here. I don't know whether that answers your question, but I really don't have an answer for it.
Michael, do you want to?
That's great.
Or Brenda? Okay. Thank you, Brenda. Michael, do you want to?
Yeah, at the risk of being like the dullest and least imaginative human in the conversation, is it actually well established that these things would be so radically different from live elements already present in human communications and politics. Like, so we already have people who bring personal experiences, private commitments, religious commitments, principles of behavior and action into political spaces, and they operationalize them, sometimes reasonably, sometimes very unreasonably. Like, this already makes up the political space of interaction for human beings. So I wonder sometimes, I mean, this is a very general question, and you know, in this kind of speculative space, like, if we've actually really conceptually established in a clear way that any of these perspective phenomena or contacts or regimens of interaction or whatever are actually as radically different, radically novel, radically differentiated from the kinds of conflicts, diversities, spoken commitments, unspoken commitments, private experiences, lived experiences, legacies of trauma, all of these other kinds of things that are already like principal determining factors in humans interacting with each other, disputing about things, and trying to come to some kind of livable consensus. So kind of curious, just generally speaking, what people think about that, or what the warrant is for the very consistent claim pretty much across the board in this space, UAP studies or whatever you want to call it, that, well, this is radically transformatively different necessarily, and maybe this like sort of limited case of like this sort of not spectacular, you know, like grand revelation, in which the implicit assumption is like, well, it's a spectacular grand revelation of another intelligence that we're interacting with, and so like there's this immense pressure specifically that it's like you're speaking for the human race, for the planet, etc.
Yeah, I mean, this is folding so many things into one here. I'm just gonna yeah, I'll try and machete my way through this. So would it be so different? I think if you listen to these people and you, for argument's sake, take what they say at face value, they are under the impression that this is something out of the ordinary. You know, as Carl Sagan said, you know, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, which I think is a nonsensical principle, but anyway, that's where it comes from. They experience these encounters, whatever you want to call them, as not exactly run-of-the-mill. Let's put it that way. And the thing that, you know, when you talk about we already have different experiences, your convictions, all that, what they are talking about, what they are trying to tell us who are not experiencers, is that there are facts which they experience. So it's not like we're talking about political convictions, but we're talking about lived experience that is, and the word's been used so much just today, it has been foisted upon them. It's most of the time not of their choosing. So I think it is a big thing. You know, and as I said at the beginning, I'd be scared to death of having such an encounter. I don't really, I'm not looking for it. But you hear from people who have been there that the more you look for it, the more you get them. And it's becoming an addiction for some people to find these contexts over and over and over again, and actually to make them actually more drastic. So, but there we are. You know, this is something which is paranormal. Yeah, we're not talking about normal lived experience anymore. If all of that is real, at least to some extent, we're in the paranormal, what used to be called the occult. And that's, I think, where intellectual epistemology kind of ends, unless you're applying your epistemology in the system of lived experience. But from outside, if you're not an experiencer, you will not be able to determine the seriousness of such an experience. So it's very difficult for me to answer a question like that. The only thing which came to mind is I'm currently reading Pasulka's new book, Encounters, and she recounts one episode. I forgot the name of the person. It may be the Gray Man or Tyler T or whatever she calls him, who has this encounter with what probably was the typical Gray, who stood outside his house and addressed him actually with "Good evening, doctor," which means that they are actually capable of communicating. However, I don't know. So these experience or the yes, exactly, Carrie Mullis. So the entities which kind of produce these experiences are actually potentially capable of communicating already from their side. But again, I mean, it's, as I said at the beginning, once you talk UAP, rationality goes out the window, and it's something of experience. You can have rational research, and that's what we're doing in the society, but we're actually trying to get a rational view on the whole thing, scientifically rigorous. But once you're moving inside that circle of experience, it's all over the place. So yeah, again, an answer which is probably not satisfactory, but that's where I am.
Michael, do you want to follow up on that, or shall we pass it over? We have some comments.
Pass it over. I've spoken.
Yeah, we have some comments, and Professor Bohlander, I don't know how much more you can tolerate, but we have some more, because we're almost at the 2-hour mark, I think, right? Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
15 more minutes. You know about my health issues, so I'd rather,
right. That's why, right. That's why I'm asking. So I will restrain myself, but there are 2 questions in the queue here by AF Abbasi. If I could read them. One question involves the issue of the general state of preparedness of states in this kind of a scenario. So the question is, have measures been taken, I think I know the answer to that, but by major states to prevent people around the world from panicking after the official announcement of meaningful contact with aliens? That's question number 1 from AF Abbasi. And the second, what would happen to the religious thoughts that deny the possibility, or thinking that denies the possibility of other intelligent species, other than God, other than the usual pantheon in a religious schema, gods, demons, angels, etc. So.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you, Asli, for these questions. Asli and I are friends, so
Yeah.
On the preparedness, I probably have to agree with Mike that if we are prepared, if there are any preparations, they don't tell us about it. I had, and I also reported in my book, a conversation with a senior officer from West Point on that, and I asked him, well, are there any kind of plans in the drawer for what happens if there is contact, or are there any plans about how humanity would project military power into outer space? And the response that he had was that he doesn't know about it, but he said that the American military are obsessive planners, and he wouldn't be surprised if there were such plans in the drawer. And then, of course, you did the entire discussion about Area 55 and reverse engineering, and all of that comes into it. How much of it is true, and if we have reverse engineered anything, why is it not flying through our airspace, or possibly these modern stealth bombers? Possibly that's already part of reverse engineer. I don't know. We're getting to again to speculation territory, but he at least thought that he wouldn't be surprised if there were plans, kind of contingency plans for that scenario. The religious issue, of course, a very, very big issue, which I'm surprised we haven't talked about before. If you have religions that do not allow for other religions to be equally true or valid, then there's a major, major problem. And it was just Christianity is one of those where a certain proponents of Christianity, especially in the evangelical sector, would find it very, very difficult to argue, for example, what the effect of Christ's death on the cross and resurrection would be for another species, where, as we can imagine, Christ never showed up. And there's a recent book by a British theologian where it shows you this really tortured, this not torture, not in the negative sense, but in the actual sense, the tortured discussion of coming to terms with the possibility that what you've been believing all your life may actually not map onto reality. So yeah, it's a other religions like Buddhism, they probably don't have much of a problem with alien species because they don't have this claim of being exclusive, like the three Semitic religions, for example, or maybe Judaism. I'm not really qualified to talk on that, but I think Judaism doesn't have that much of a problem with it either. And the Catholic Church has, you know, Guy Consolmagno is one of the main people in that area, and they don't seem to have too much of a problem. And they're certainly not going to force baptize aliens if they arrive on Earth. I think that's so far the taken understanding. But it will actually touch people in one of the very fundamental areas of their lives. And but in a sense, you already have it in on Earth when you're talking about different religions. People may have read Lessing's A Parable of the Three Rings. It's not very well known outside Germany, I think, but that's one prime example of how to address that. And that there have been similar stories as actually in the Muslim context hundreds of years before that. In the interhuman context, and I'm giving full disclosure that I'm a Christian. I have taken solace from something which Ben de Lamar, grandson of the author Walter de Lamar, has said. He's also at Durham University, or used to be, and he said, you know, in all of that, he remains loyal to Jesus. So it is, you know, at some stage you have to come to a conclusion, make a choice for yourself, and live with the consequences. So I don't have much of a problem with the idea that, you know, once aliens crop up and come up with a different idea of where it is, of what the religious overview of the universe might be, because in a sense, you know, I'm not trying to proselytize here, but if you are a believer, then the main thing is if you're believing in a God rather than you're a different religion where God does not really play a part, then, you know, that God does not necessarily only manifest itself, himself, herself, in one particular manner. So I'm fairly relaxed about that, because the main thing is I believe there is a God, but you know, from that one you don't really get to any particular religion. So I'm stopping my sermon here, but you know, it's a very fundamental problem, and which again needs to be addressed, preferably before it happens.
Thank you, Michael. So, Steve, I guess we could begin to put our sort of closing thoughts maybe together, and then bring it to a conclusion. So, Steve, and then Michael, if you have any closing reflections. But go ahead, Steve.
Well, first of all, this would have been a great way to close, actually, with Michael Bohlander's sermon. I was really moved by that, actually, and it does, you know, if you have a certain view of God as manifesting in different forms and different embodiments, then that could actually provide a fairly hopeful sign in terms of the attitude with which we would deal with these extraterrestrials. So, I mean, there's that in a way as a kind of takeaway message. The one other thing I wanted to raise in response to the previous thing that Michael was talking about the more occult style of experiences that people who encounter UAPs have. And this is something that Michael and I spoke about the first time we had a conversation about this. The idea that these experiences and you're right to call them kind of occult, may be connected with the need for a new kind of physics, right? A, you know, kind of more multi-dimensional physics. I mean, and I recall the fact that in the early 20th century, when you start to get this sort of efflorescence of occultism in the West, right? That it was, to a large extent, connected up with the relativity theory, with quantum mechanics as it was coming on there, and people trying to, you know, in a way, kind of interpret the new physics in light of religious experience and so forth. And this may be a case where if we sort of, you know, if we sort of put funding into more exotic forms of physics that actually did explore these alternative kinds of cosmologies, it might make a better fit in terms of understanding these experiences that people are already having, and might actually make us better prepared, right, if these UAPs are in fact coming from another dimension, and so in a way violate the laws of physics as we normally understand them, right? And so this would be an opportunity now to invest in this kind of alternative, more expansive form of physics, which may, as a byproduct, enable us to understand these occult experiences better.
Sorry, I meant to respond to that. Yeah, I agree. I mean, we need to start thinking outside the box, and that would be one way of thinking outside the box. And we've seen through human history a lot of stuff which we thought was magic turned out to be just science we haven't understood yet. And it may be the same way in this context. But I would just, again, because it's a religious, spiritual background, there might be things which are not able to be perceived by science, and they remain personal experiences. Always, the one thing when people ask me about, you know, how can you believe in God, and then I said it's my experience. It's the same thing as you try and explain to a person who never touched water what water feels like. Difficult. Yeah. So, and I just wanted to caution against this idea that everything will one way be explained by science. I think we're short-selling human experience with that. But I'm back on the proselytizing track again. I'm stopping now.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Do you have any final thoughts or closing reflections that you'd like to add before we end?
Sure. You know, it'll be short. I mean, I think, you know, as basically an intellectual historian of a pretty sober bent, I think it's worth noting that, you know, the underlying conceptual commitments that affect or constrain what looks plausible or speculative or conceivable or inconceivable, if they're not historically determined, I don't really think they are, but if they're not historically determined, then they're at least heavily historically conditioned. And one of the things that always seems to be underlying these discussions is just like the deeply even architectonic way in which anthropocentric assumptions just seem immediately present to us as just like the way that humans view the world and have always viewed the world. And like there's lots of cognitive constraints, and it'd be very interesting to trace out the cognitive constraints of the human species on a much longer time scale. But, you know, kind of apropos of some of Michael's comments about religions, it's just, you know, I think the non-anthropocentric conceptual material that is available to us, like just on a slightly longer historical time scale, it's like it seems relatively recent to me, meaning the past couple of 100 years, that the idea that there could be intelligences or are intelligences that are not just reducible to sort of contemporary instrumental economic man is actually like a really recent one and a really novel one. So I think it should be pretty unsurprising, actually, if you take a slightly more historically mediated perspective. It's sort of unsurprising that religious traditions and like human cultures like have all sorts of ways of conceptualizing these things. We're actually sort of in the unusual position, I think, of finding it just so unbelievably difficult. And I mean, the we here is extremely expansive, whatever you want to call it, but the notion that anthropocentrism is not just the foundation of the world, I don't think is just something to take for granted. I think it's a pretty recent development that's tied up with a lot of very complex things. And so I think it's like something to bear in mind in these kinds of conversations, generally speaking, is that that is actually a conceptual formation. It's a conceptual formation that can be, the reference here is to it, the anthropocentrism that underlies these conversations often, whether it's a constraint or a commitment, but it is a conceptual formation that has a backstory. It developed, it received articulation in particular kinds of ways. You can even go back, 200 years and find people discussing similar kinds of topics in a relatively straightforward way sometimes. It's not that it isn't speculative, but there's an serious way in which like the underlying conceptual material like really affects what seems plausible to us, what seems possible to us, what seems speakable or whatever. And like that cashes out in really material kinds of ways when we talk about the human and intelligence and all of these kinds of things that are not just like stable givens. So I think that's my last comment.
Thank you. And Professor Bohlander, would you like to offer any final reflections, final thoughts?
No, none other than that I found it a very, very stimulating, interesting discussion, and it's helpful for my future thinking of having heard all these different approaches to it, and I'm just very glad that you had me for this colloquium, and I thank you for it.
And thank you too, Michael. It was really wonderful, really fascinating conversation. A lot of interesting strands of this to follow up on and think through in relation also to your book, which is really, really wonderful, right? New territory definitely being opened up here. Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you, Michael Uhal and Professor Fuller, or Steve, sorry, for your really insightful comments today. And thanks to everybody who joined us for these few hours. Please stay tuned for the society. We have the idealist philosopher Bernardo Kastrup, who will join us in at the end of May, and discussion of yet another speculative hypothesis, which seems to be de rigueur in UAP studies often, which is the Silurian hypothesis. We'll have another colloquium with him. Everybody here is welcome to join us. We have our conference we're planning in August, middle of August, August 16th to the 18th. So please stay tuned about that. Greg Ighigian's new book will be dropping at the beginning of June, and Greg will be joining us for a colloquium on his book in July at some point. So we've got a lot of events coming up. Adam Frank is going to give our inaugural Cosmos lecture, sort of in honor kind of Carl Sagan and his thinking to some extent. And Adam Frank will join us, I think, in June for a talk there for a lecture. So please stay tuned. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a wonderful evening, afternoon, and I might just go back to sleep and enjoy the rest of the morning and thinking of, horrible contact scenarios and maybe not so horrible. But thank you so much, everybody. Good night. Good luck wherever you are. Take care.
That's all.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.